The rain came in sideways off Route 9 like it had a personal grievance against everything still standing. It had been building since late afternoon, the kind of storm that announces itself through barometric pressure before the first drop falls, the kind that makes old cattle dogs refuse to leave the porch and makes the air smell like iron filings and wet soil and something older than either. By 9:30 in the evening, the sky over Harlow County had turned the color of a bruise left untreated for days, and the temperature had dropped 14 degrees in under an hour. And the trees along the highway's shoulder were bending in the gusts with the resigned flexibility of things that had bent this way before and expected to bend this way again. The iron remnants had been riding since dawn. 67 motorcycles, mostly Harleys, a few Indians, one ancient Triumph that belonged to a man named Cord Locke, who had been riding the same machine for 22 years and refused to explain why to anyone who asked, even when it broke down on the side of the highway in the August heat and left him waiting for a flatbed with the particular patience of a man who has decided that some loyalties are not subject to rational review and are not going to become subject to it regardless of how many times the engine fails on a Tuesday. They were not a weekend club. They were not men who played at being something on Saturdays and returned to ordinary lives on Monday mornings with the comfortable knowledge that the costume came off at the end of the ride. Most of them had come back from somewhere. Iraq, Afghanistan, county lockup, marriages that had ended without clean edges, childhoods that had required more from them than childhoods were supposed to require. They had each found separately and then together that the only place the noise inside their heads went genuinely quiet was at 70 miles an hour with the wind hitting their face like a closed fist and the road stretching out in front of them in a straight, unambiguous line that required nothing except forward motion. Colt Briggs rode at the front. He was 43 years old and carried his age in the specific way that men carry it when the years have included things they will never fully describe. A scar ran from his left eyebrow down to the line of his jaw. Not a bar fight scar, not an accident. The kind of deliberate surgical mark that gets left on a face when someone intends the mark to be permanent, intends it to be visible. It intends it to be the first thing a person sees when they look at you. He had never explained it to anyone who hadn't been there. The men who had ridden with him long enough had stopped asking years ago. His hands on the throttle were steady even as the rain came sheeting across the highway hard enough to reduce the lane markers to suggestions and the tree line to a dark blur on either side. The men behind him held formation not because any club rule required it, but because Colt Briggs had the quality that cannot be manufactured in any training program ever devised. The specific calm of a person who has already survived the worst thing they could imagine and then decided, in full possession of that knowledge, to keep going. It was not bravery in the performed sense. It was something quieter and more durable than bravery. It was the decision made once and not revisited to remain in the world and do the work the world put in front of you. He had been a combat medic, 2 tours. He still carried a field trauma kit in his right saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth, maintained with the same discipline he had applied to his medical equipment in the field, which was the discipline of someone who understood that the difference between a tool functioning and not functioning was sometimes the difference between a person living and not living, and that this was not a philosophical position, but a practical reality he had encountered enough times to stop being surprised by it. On the inside of his left wrist, small enough that most people never noticed it unless they were close and looking, was a tattoo. 2 letters, DB. He had gotten it done in a shop in Billings, Montana 11 years ago, 3 weeks after coming home from his second deployment, to find that coming home was not the event he had carried in his mind for 8 months as a destination. The letter stood for Danny Briggs, his son, 8 years old on the Tuesday afternoon in October, when a car he was not in failed to stop at an intersection it should have stopped at. Colt had been 8,000 miles away doing work that had seemed until that Tuesday to be the most important thing he could be doing with his life. He did not talk about Danny, not to anyone, not ever. The storm got bad enough at 9:15 that visibility dropped below 30 feet and Colt raised his fist. The column pulled off at the first lit sign visible through the rain and the dark. May's Roadside Diner, open 24 hours, hot coffee. The neon was partially operational, the O in open dark and the second F in coffee, flickering in a rhythm that suggested it was making a decision about whether to continue. The parking lot was gravel and standing water, and the particular mud that forms when gravel has been soaked long enough to release the earth beneath it. The building had the look of a roadside institution that had been feeding truckers and county workers and people passing through since before most of the iron remnants had been born of Formica countertops, and a slowly rotating pie display in a jukebox in the far corner, playing something with a pedal steel guitar that nobody had selected and that fit the weather with an accuracy that felt intentional. 67 motorcycles dismounting in sequence produced a sound that was itself a kind of weather. All those engines cutting simultaneously the immediate replacement of mechanical noise by the hiss of rain on hot metal and the wet scrape of boots on gravel in 67 different versions of the physical relief that comes from getting off a bike after a long, wet ride in deteriorating conditions. They moved toward this building, leather and denim road wet and cold breath visible in the October air. The diner windows lit up with the reflected heat of their bodies before the door even opened. The woman behind the counter was May Gallagher. Mid-50s dark hair threaded through with gray in two distinct streaks that ran back from her temples like rivers finding their course. She had the unhurried, load-bearing movements of someone who had been on her feet since well before sunrise and had made a settled peace with that fact sometime in her 30s and not revisited it since. She looked out at 67 people coming through her door, and she did not hesitate, did not reach for a phone, did not calculate whether her establishment could handle it. She pulled a second coffee urn from under the counter, fired the industrial grill, and began issuing instructions to her two waitresses with the economy of a person who has run this particular operation enough times to know exactly where the pressure points are. Colt liked her from the first 30 seconds. The iron remnants filled every booth, every counter stool, every square foot of standing room that could reasonably hold a human being without creating a situation. The noise climbed fast, the sound of 67 men in a confined space after a long day on the road, voices and laughter, and the percussion of heavy mugs on Formica, and the scrape of chairs being repositioned to make room. Wet leather released its particular compound smell, earth and road oil, and the faint chemical residue of long-distance riding. Someone ordered the entire pie display in a single transaction without looking at what was on it. Cordlock removed his soaking jacket at his booth and wrung it out directly onto the floor beside him without looking at anyone or offering any explanation for this action. Colt sat at the counter. He sat with his back to the counter surface and his face to the room, which was how he always sat in unfamiliar spaces. Coffee in his right-hand left wrist, resting on his knee with the DB tattoo facing down. He was not tense. He was not running threat assessments in the way that produces visible alertness. He was doing the quieter thing, the thing he had developed over 2 deployments and 20 years of living inside his own particular experience, which was maintaining the low, constant attention of a person who has learned that emergencies arrive most reliably in the spaces where everyone else is looking somewhere else. That was when he saw the girl. She came in through the service entrance on the east side of the building. Not the front door, which 67 men had just moved through in a continuous stream. The door that accessed the kitchen through the storage area. The door that people use only when they know it exists or when they have learned through practice to enter spaces without drawing attention to the entering. She was approximately 10 years old. Small for it if that was her age, wearing a jacket that was at minimum 2 sizes too large, a man's dark canvas jacket with the sleeves pulled down past her wrists despite the fact that she had arrived soaking from the rain outside. The jacket did not belong to her. Nothing about its size or shape was hers, but she wore it with the specific intentionality of a person for whom covering her wrists in all circumstances was not a choice but a requirement, something decided at a level below the level where choices get made. Her eyes moved fast when she entered. One complete sweep of the room beginning at the service entrance and moving in a clockwise arc that missed nothing and took less than 2 seconds. This was not the way a child looks at a new place with curiosity or excitement. This was the systematic scan of a person who needs to know immediately and completely where the exits are and which of the adults present represent which categories of risk. It was a practiced assessment, efficient and thorough, and it belonged on the face of someone who had been running it long enough that it operated without conscious direction. Behind her, gripping the hem of her jacket with both small fists, was a boy, younger by several years, 6 or close to it. He wore a t-shirt inadequate for the temperature and sneakers in which the sole on the left foot had separated from the upper at the toe and been repaired at some point with a strip of tape that had not survived the rain. His hair was wet and flat against his forehead. He was shaking, but not from the cold alone. There was a quality to his trembling that had nothing to do with temperature, the tremor of a small body that has been running on sustained fear for long enough that fear has become its physiological baseline. Colt watched them move through the room. They were good at it. The girl navigated through 67 iron remnants with practiced efficiency, angling through the crowd without touching anyone, without making eye contact with a single adult male, in the space constructing a path that maintained maximum distance from every grown man she passed. The boy matched her exactly, his face, essentially pressed against her back, mirroring her angles and her movements with the precision of someone who had learned this specific choreography through repetition until it required no conscious thought. Nobody in the room noticed them. That was the thing that hit Colt in the sternum like something slow and blunt. Two soaking children moving through a packed diner at 9:45 on a Wednesday night in October, and not one of the 67 men in the room turned to look. Not one person registered their presence as something that required attention or response. The world had a way of not seeing what it had already decided at some level below articulation that it did not want to deal with. He had seen it on two continents. He was seeing it now in a diner in Harlow County. It was exactly as clarifying as it had always been. He set his coffee down. He did not move yet. The girl was heading for the back corner booth, the dead-end position, one wall on the left and one wall behind, no clean exit if something came at her from the front. She sat down with her back to the corner and pulled the boy in tight beside her. She picked up the menu, turned it over, looked at the back, set it down with her hands folded on top of it. Colt understood the arithmetic immediately. She had sat down to get warm and to remain invisible, and she had looked at the menu because that was the action that bought time in a diner before someone came to ask you to leave or to order, and she had already calculated that she could not order, and she had already calculated exactly how long she could maintain the performance of being a customer before someone arrived to end it. He looked down at his left wrist for a moment, then he picked up his coffee and walked to the back of the room. Grady Carver was 3 stools down from where Colt had been sitting. 6'4", approximately 290 pounds, with a beard that had been accumulating since a bet in 2019, whose original terms nobody in the club could fully reconstruct anymore. He had the kind of face that made strangers on the street recalculate their trajectory out of pure instinct. He also had a quality that only the iron remnants knew about, the deliberate, careful gentleness he used around anything small and frightened, which was identical to the quality he used around injured animals, which was not a coincidence, and which he had never explained to anyone. Colt caught his eye as he moved toward the back corner. He stopped at the edge of the booth. The girl looked up at him the moment he arrived, already prepared. He watched her run her assessment. His height, the cut on his jacket and the patch on his chest, the scar running down his face. She completed the evaluation in approximately 2 seconds, and her hands moved under the table to find the boy's arm. Colt sat down across from them without asking permission to do so. He did not lean forward. He did not produce a smile calibrated to reassure. He put his coffee on the table and said in the same even register he used for everything that actually mattered, "Cold night." The girl said nothing. The boy pressed harder against her side. Colt looked at the menu. "Biscuits are good here. Stopped through once before a long time back." He let the silence hold for a moment. Then, "You eaten today?" 4 beats of silence. Then the girl's jaw shifted a small internal adjustment, and she said in a voice that barely reached above the ambient noise of the diner, "We haven't eaten since yesterday." The booth nearest them had 2 iron remnants mid-conversation. They went quiet. Then the table behind that one. The silence moved outward through the room, the way silence moves in a crowded space when the gravitational center of the room shifts, spreading in a slow, complete wave until it reached the counter, and May had already turned from her grill and was looking toward the back corner. The girl understood that the room had changed. Her eyes went wide, the first genuine alarm she had shown since entering. "It's all right," Colt said quietly and directly. "Nobody's going to make you go anywhere." He raised 2 fingers toward May without turning around. She already had the order pad in her hand. "Order what you want," Colt said. She looked at the menu. The calculation was legible on her face, the calculation he recognized from the faces of people in field stations and evacuation points, from people who had been in desperate enough circumstances for long enough that receiving help had become more frightening than not receiving it. Because help always carried a cost, and the cost was always eventually presented. She was trying to determine what the back end of this looked like. What would be required from her in exchange? Just food, Colt said. Nothing else. Her name was Sadie. Her brother's name was Leo. She offered the names and nothing further, and Colt did not reach for anything more. He watched them eat. They ate the way people eat when the next meal is not a certainty. Fast and close to the plate, bodies angled slightly forward and over the food protective. Leo held his plate near his chest. Sadie ate with one eye on the room. Colt drank his coffee and said nothing and let them eat. Grady appeared at the end of the booth with 2 slices of cherry pie, one in each hand, wearing the expression of elaborate casualness that he deployed around small, frightened things, the look of a man performing a routine administrative task that has nothing to do with anyone at this table. He set one slice in front of Leo without comment, without eye contact, and then turned partially away from the booth, making himself smaller, a large man's version of creating space. Leo looked at the pie, then at Grady's turned shoulder. Then he picked up the fork. Something shifted behind Sadie's eyes when he did. Not relief, not yet, but a hairline fracture in the wall, the kind that appears when a person's defenses have been continuously engaged for so long that a single unearned act of ordinary decency arrives with a force out of proportion to the act itself. It was the sleeves that stayed with Colt. Every time Sadie reached for something, every time she lifted her fork or turned toward Leo or reached for the water glass May had set down without being asked, the sleeve of the oversized jacket rode up fractionally, and she caught it and pulled it back. She did it without looking. The automatic motion of a habit so deeply trained into the body that it operated below the threshold of conscious thought, the way you flinch before you know what you're flinching at. Colt had treated injuries in 2 different countries. He knew exactly what a person looked like when they were keeping something on their arms covered and keeping that covering consistent regardless of the situation. He kept his eyes on her face and did not look at the sleeves. Once in the half second before the cuff came back down, he caught the edge of it. The border of a bruise on the inside of her left forearm, the color and the shape of something that had not come from walking into a doorframe. He drank his coffee. He did not change his expression. He did not look again. The diner had resettled into its noise. The jukebox had cycled to something slower. Outside, the rain against the windows had found a sustained rhythm, a steady percussion that made the lit interior of Maze feel more enclosed, more deliberately separate from the dark and the highway and everything on the other side of the glass. Colt was thinking about the word clinic, which he had not yet seen. He was thinking about a 6-digit number, which he had not yet found. He was thinking about the shape of a situation that his body had already understood before his mind had completed the argument for it. Then the door opened and cold air came in with a man. Colt felt the change in the room before he completed the visual on it. Not the gentle gravitational shift of 2 quiet children entering through a side door. Something with edges, something that moved through a space differently than ordinary movement. The man who came through the front door was tall, lean in the way that suggests discipline, applied in service of something other than health. Dark canvas jacket, dark jeans, work boots with a military parallel in their construction that had nothing to do with any actual military service. His face was clean-shaven and arranged pleasantly enough. He had the kind of eyes that performed warmth when his mouth performed a smile, but nothing behind the eyes participated in the performance. They stayed flat and measuring and continuous in the way a camera lens stays flat, recording the room without any feeling about what it records. He moved through the crowd toward the back corner with the unhurried confidence of a man for whom spaces exist to be moved through. He stopped at the booth. "There you are," he said. The voice was warm and parental and calibrated with a precision that Colt registered as a physical sensation, the awareness of a mechanism operating just below the surface of something presenting as organic. "I've been looking everywhere for you two." Leo went rigid. The smallest possible movement, a stiffening, a fractional withdrawal, the body answering before the mind had organized its official response. Colt caught it the moment it happened. He caught the way Sadie's left hand found Leo's under the table and gripped, and the way her face reorganized itself in the half-second following the smooth, practiced reorganization of a child who had been performing this specific neutral expression long enough that she could produce it without any preparation time. Not calm, the performance of calm. The distinction was visible if you were looking for it. "This your father?" Colt asked Sadie directly. The man looked at Colt with the pleasant, steady expression that had not changed. "Appreciate you looking after them," he said. "Kids wandered off in the storm." He reached for Sadie's shoulder. She did not flinch. She was too well trained for that, had been managing the flinch response for long enough that it no longer surfaced in situations like this one. But her eyes found Colt's in the half-second before the hand landed on her shoulder, and what was in them was not the expression of a child caught somewhere she was not supposed to be. It was something older and more tired and more specific. The expression of someone who has stopped expecting anyone to notice, and who is now noticing that someone has noticed and does not yet know what to do with that. "Buy you a coffee," Colt said to the man. "Storm's not letting up for a while." "We're good." The hand on Sadie's shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly, almost at the threshold of what anyone not already watching for it would register. "Need to get these kids home. Road's bad out there. We'll manage." He was already steering them out of the booth, one hand on Sadie's shoulder, the movement practiced and smooth the ease of someone who has executed this exact transition in this kind of public space, with this kind of audience enough times that it has become reflexive. When Leo stumbled, getting up, the man's hand shot out and caught his arm. Too fast. Too practiced. The grip of a person who knows precisely how much force to apply in a public setting to achieve control while leaving no visible evidence of the application. Colt stood up. He did not step forward. He did not raise his hands or shift his weight into anything that could be read as a physical challenge. He simply rose to his full height, and the man looked at him, and for the first time the pleasant expression did not immediately reassemble itself after the interruption. There was a pause, half a second, in which something genuine appeared behind the flat eyes. Not fear, a recalculation. The expression of a man who has encountered a variable he had not included in his planning and is now rapidly adjusting. Then the front door opened again. Sheriff Dale Boone came in with his deputy Vince Cobb, a step and a half behind. Boone was 50 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the settled, load-bearing authority of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he entered for the past 15 years, and had adjusted to that condition the way you adjust to any condition that has been true long enough by ceasing to notice it. He wore his department jacket. His eyes moved across the room, found the man with the children, and his expression settled into something that was not the expression of a law enforcement officer assessing an unfamiliar situation. It was the expression of a man confirming what he already expected to find. "Rex," Boone said, moving through the crowd toward the back of the diner. Not sir, not any formal address. Rex, the shorthand of familiarity. Rex, that was the man's name. Rex Decker. Boone looked at Colt. He looked at the 67 iron remnants occupying every available surface of May's roadside diner. He did not look worried. In a county this size, 67 unfamiliar motorcycles would place most local law enforcement into a specific kind of heightened readiness. Boone looked like a man assessing a logistical complication that he would need to manage. "You boys just passing through," he said. "Storm," Colt said. Boone nodded slowly. Then he looked at Sadie and Leo. His face did not change. He looked at two soaking children at 9:45 on a Wednesday night in October, small and wet, and standing beside a man whose grip on the girl's shoulder had not loosened, and his expression remained completely professionally neutral. Not concerned, not curious, not the face of a man registering the presence of something that required his professional attention. That neutrality was not natural. It was constructed. Colt had seen it before in people who had been adjacent to specific things for long enough that their ordinary human responses to those things had been deliberately overwritten. You could see the work of the overwriting if you knew what to look for. Boone's neutrality was the product of practice, not disposition. Rex Decker was already moving Sadie and Leo toward the front of the diner, steering them through the crowd, with Boone and Cobb flanking the group in the casual, unrehearsed choreography of people who had performed this specific configuration before. Together, in this arrangement. The three adults and two children moving toward the exit with the synchronized ease of a practiced routine. Colt watched them go. He watched Leo's free hand press flat against his own thigh, knuckle white the self-steadying grip of a small person holding themselves together from the inside when there is nothing on the outside to hold on to. He watched Sadie move through the crowd, with her body present and her attention already somewhere beyond the room, already calculating what came next and what came after that. Then her head turned back. One look. Through 20 feet of crowded diner, through the bodies and the news and the rain on the windows, she found Colt's eyes. She held them for one full second, and she mouthed two words. He could not hear them, but he read them across the distance without difficulty. Don't let. The crowd shifted and she was through the door, and the cold air came through one final time, and the door swung shut, and May's roadside diner was just a diner again. Boone was still at the back of the room, watching Colt with the same administrative patience he had projected since he walked in. "Good night to stay off the road," he said. "Probably," Colt said. Boone nodded once with the air of a man confirming something that required no further discussion, and walked out. Cobb followed without looking at anyone. Slade Flynn appeared at Colt's shoulder. 49 years old, the Iron Remnant's road captain, with the economical load-bearing quality of a man who had spent 30 years keeping other men alive through the consequences of their worst decisions. He kept his voice below the ambient noise of the room. "You see the kids?" "Yeah." The boy's arm when the man grabbed him getting up. "I saw it." A pause, then, "What do you want to do?" Colt looked at the seat where Sadie had been sitting. There was something there. He had not seen her place it. That was the detail that would stay with him afterward, the understanding that she had done it without his noticing, which meant she had done it while managing Rex's hand on her shoulder and Leo's weight against her side, and the calculation of timing and placement and attention. She had managed all of that simultaneously and still positioned it precisely face down, tucked under the lip of the plate, findable but not visible from a standing angle. A folded square of diner napkin. He reached for it, opened it on the table with both hands flat so Slade could read it without being asked. 4 words in the center of the napkin. Block letters, careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had taught herself to be absolutely clear when clarity was the only thing she had to work with. "Don't let him take us." Below that, written smaller and faster, the letters slightly less uniform, but the precision still present a 6-digit number. And one word, clinic. And beneath the napkin, where the napkin had been resting, a white laminated rectangle with a magnetic stripe and a small barcode, and a handwritten 6-digit number in the same block letters as the napkin. A key card. She had left the key card. Colt looked at the door. Through the rain-blurred glass, 2 sets of headlights were moving away down the dark road, moving fast, already being swallowed by the storm. He looked down at his left wrist. DB, 2 letters for a boy who had been 8 years old on a Tuesday afternoon in October on a road that Colt had driven 100 times. He had been 8,000 miles away. He closed the napkin in his fist. "Get Grady," he said to Slade. "Get Cord. Get Dax. We're going." "Colt, we don't know what we're—" "She's 10 years old." He picked up his jacket from the stool. She wrote that note before she sat down. She had the card ready. She had the number memorized. He looked at the door. She's been trying to tell someone for a long time. Tonight she found someone. He walked toward the door. The iron remnants near the entrance read something in his movement, the specific directed quality of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it, and they cleared the path without being asked. May caught his eye from behind the counter. She said nothing. Her face said she had seen the children too, and it said what it said, and it did not need words. Colt pushed through the door into the rain. The headlights were gone. The storm had taken them. The cold of Harlow County in October hit him like a wall, the specific cold that smells like iron and wet leaves and the emptiness of highway country at night. His boots hit the gravel and the water came up over the soles, and he stood in the rain with the napkin in his fist and the key card in his jacket pocket and the dark road in front of him. Behind him, 4 Harleys fired. Then Cord's Triumph arguing loudly with itself before it caught and found its rhythm. Colt mounted up. Somewhere ahead, a 10-year-old girl had written 4 words on a diner napkin and left a key card under the edge of a plate and mouthed 2 words across a crowded room to a stranger, and she had been precise enough to include a location and a code. Not just a cry for help, a plan. A plan that had been refined, he understood, over more than one attempt, over more attempts than he wanted to count. He pulled onto the road. The headlight cut a single line through the black. He was not going to make her wrong about him. The road out of town was cracked asphalt that had been patched twice in the last decade and showed the evidence of both attempts in uneven ridges that grabbed at tires and standing water. The shoulder was gravel dropping off into drainage ditches running fast and dark. The trees on either side were close enough that their branches formed a broken canopy overhead that did nothing useful about the rain. Colt rode with the high beam cutting 30 feet ahead and trusted the rest to what he knew mattered more than what was behind him. Slade Flynn was on his left, Grady Carver on his right, Cord Lock and Dax Holden in a close formation behind. 5 bikes, not 67. That had been the argument 40 seconds flat in the gravel parking lot of Maze, while the rain came straight down, and the rest of the iron remnants stood in the light from the diner windows watching their president move towards something that had no club vote behind it and no clear framework around it. Slade had said it directly in the parking lot, which was how Slade always said the hard thing, because Slade Flynn had spent 30 years watching men make decisions in compressed time frames and had developed a strong preference for honesty over comfort in those moments. You're riding into a county you don't know following a vehicle you already lost in the dark on the basis of a note a child wrote on a napkin. Yeah, Colt said, that's not a plan. No. Slade had looked at the road, then at Colt. Then he mounted his bike without another word, and that was the answer that mattered. The others followed without discussion. The clinic appeared on the left and at 4.5 miles out, right at the edge of where the keycard's existence suggested it would be. A converted single-story building with the architectural quality of a structure that had served several purposes over several decades, each renovation imperfectly concealing the previous iteration. The sign read Harlow Recovery and Wellness in the clean institutional font designed to communicate trustworthiness through its very absence of character. Parking lot lights on timers, chain link fencing along the east perimeter, 11 vehicles in the lot. Colt counted them twice. 11 vehicles in the lot of a county wellness facility at 11:15 on a Wednesday night in a county with fewer than 9,000 people. That was not a night nurse and a security guard. That was not standard after-hours staffing for a small county medical facility. That was an operational shift of people who were present for a specific reason. They pulled off the road 60 yards back and cut the engines. The silence was immediate and total. Rain and wind in the ticking of Cord's Triumph cooling. 5 men on dead bikes in the dark looking at a building that presented as completely ordinary, which was its own category of information. 11 vehicles, Grady said. Past 11 at night. Nobody answered. The arithmetic was self-evident. Colt dismounted and stood looking at the fence line, tracing it east, mapping the property from what he could confirm before moving toward what he could not. He pulled the key card from his pocket and looked at it. She had carried this for 4 days. He did not know that with certainty yet, but he was beginning to understand the shape of it. Dax, he said, the county infrastructure system, if we find a hardwire access point inside. Dax Holden had spent 11 years as an IT systems engineer before he became an iron remnant in a period of approximately 3 years during which he had been both simultaneously, which was a complicated arrangement that he did not discuss in detail. If it's county standard architecture, yes, I know that build. They went over the chain link fence in the sequence Grady last his size, making it a more deliberate operation. The east side of the building was dark blank institutional concrete with a single recessed metal door. Colt swiped the card. Red light. He entered the 6 digits. Green. The door opened. The corridor inside was lit by fluorescent strips, the flat, institutional light that makes every surface perform cleanliness rather than embody it. The floor was buff tile. The smell arrived immediately, disinfectant, layered over something that no amount of disinfectant fully eliminates the specific compound of a space where people had been living in confined conditions for an extended period. Not a medical smell, not exactly. Something Colt placed faster than he wanted to. From buildings he had been in on 2 different continents. Buildings that appeared in official documentation under names that described functions other than the ones being performed inside them. His stomach went very still in the way it had learned to go still. They moved single-file Colt first, Slade on rear. The building extended further back from the road-facing facade than its exterior suggested. The first room was empty metal shelving, folded materials, a clipboard on the wall with columns of names and dates going back 14 months. Dax photographed it without being asked. The second room had a lock the keycard did not open. Colt pressed his ear to the door and heard nothing, and the two possible explanations for the silence were both bad. He was working the door frame with his hand when Cord touched his shoulder and pointed back down the corridor. Voices approaching two people, the low-energy cadence of a late-shift handoff institutional workers, doing a familiar job at an hour when alertness requires effort. Colt moved the group into the empty room and pulled the door to a crack and waited. Two figures passed, both in civilian clothes with lanyards, a man with a tablet scrolling, a woman with a thermos. "Three from the East Wing," the man said, before the weather got bad. "Where to?" "Boone's call, above my pay grade. The family group. Still here, I want documentation finalized before They turned the corner and the voices dropped away. Nobody moved for 15 counts. Then Dax, close to Colt's ear, "East Wing, family group." "I heard." They followed the corridor to its junction and took the branch heading toward the rear of the property. The fluorescent lighting deteriorated here, one strip flickering one out entirely. The doors changed character. The ones they had passed were institutional, but unremarkable. These had additional hardware, a second lock beneath the card reader, reinforced frames, no window panels. Less about privacy, more about containment. Colt ran the card at the nearest one. Nothing. The code produced nothing. Different clearance. The card had gotten them through service areas and corridors. It could not open these rooms, which meant Sadie had access to move through the building, but not to access these specific rooms from the outside, which meant she had been brought into them, not arriving at them independently. The cold that moved through him had nothing to do with his wet jacket. "We need the system," he said. Dax moved down the corridor and found a door that the card opened without a code inside it. A rack of network equipment with green indicator lights blinking in the dark and a workstation running idle. The smell of electronics and recycled air. 8 minutes, Colt said. Dax sat down and his hands became immediately efficient, the hands of someone genuinely competent at what they are doing rather than performing competence. Slade positioned himself at the corridor junction. Cord held the service entrance. Grady stood with Colt, which was where Grady positioned himself in the situations that might require physical presence, not because anyone had told him to, but because Grady understood that mass in the right location is itself a form of argument. "Boone," Grady said low. "At the diner, he called Decker by first name, not like a cop knows someone from a case file." "Like they'd had dinner," Colt said. "More than once." Colt nodded. "So if what we find in here is what I think it is," Grady said, "the county sheriff is not the call we make." "No. How far up does this go?" Colt looked at the sealed doors in the corridor. "That's what I need to know before we do anything else." 3 minutes and 50 seconds later, Dax turned from the workstation with the expression of a man who has confirmed what he was afraid of confirming. He did not speak immediately. He turned back, copied everything to the small drive he had brought, then sat with his hands flat on the edge of the console. "Dax, it's a processing facility." He did not turn around. "The rooms in this wing, they're holding rooms, 14 names in the current intake log. Adults listed as voluntary residential." A pause. "The minors are listed under the adults as dependents." The fluorescent strip above them flickered. "Like property," Colt said. "Like property." Dax pulled the drive. "Transfer log covering 3 weeks. People move to addresses I can't identify, they're coded. But the vehicle manifest is attached, and every vehicle is private, non-commercial transport." He turned around. His face in the bad light had the look of someone whose processing capacity is working hard to accommodate information it keeps trying to root around. "There's a financial ledger. It's not small numbers." Nobody spoke. "How many children?" Colt said. Dax looked at the drive. 6 in the current log, 2 listed under R. Decker. Grady's face moved through several things and landed in the specific stillness of a very large man applying everything available to him to not acting on what his body wanted to do. Colt stood very still. He was completing the arithmetic. Sadie had carried that key card for 4 days. She had been inside this building behind a door that the card opened from the outside, but not from the inside, and she had waited 4 days for a moment when she could transfer the card and the information to someone who would use them. 4 days was a long time to wait when you were 10 years old and your brother was 6, and the door behind you was the kind that required more than a key card. He had to put his hand on the wall for a moment. "The East Wing rooms," he said. "Are the children in there right now?" "Log shows them checked in 4 days ago. No discharge record." He straightened. He walked out of the server room into the corridor and moved toward the sealed doors. "Colt." Slade was at the junction and 4 steps, not blocking, but closed the physical proximity of men who trust each other enough to have direct conversations about catastrophic decisions. "If we open those rooms without authorization, we are committing a crime. We have no warrant, no legal standing. We accessed this facility on a card that was left under a dinner plate. She left it for us." In a legal framework, the distinction between given and stolen is not going to matter as much as you want it to. If we take those children, we can be charged with kidnapping. And if we get arrested, those kids go back to whatever was going to happen to them. Colt stood in the corridor with the key card in his hand and the sealed doors 10 feet away and worked through it. The calculation was fast and felt like swallowing something with sharp edges throughout its duration. "Then we document," he said. "Everything the card can access. Every record, every room we can open. We get it out, we transmit it, and then, from behind the third door on the right, a sound. Small. The involuntary, half-suppressed sound of a person who has been maintaining silence but cannot hold it when they hear voices in a corridor that do not sound like the voices they have been hearing for 4 days. A child sound, very small. Grady made a sound that was not a word. And from the far end of the corridor, from the direction of the junction, Slade said one syllable in a voice from which all warmth had been completely removed. "Colt." Colt turned. Sheriff Dale Boone was at the end of the corridor with his hand on the wall-mounted light panel. He was looking at them with the expression of a man confirming what he already knew, which meant the diner had been operational, the arrival, the acknowledgement of Rex by first name, the neutral assessment of the children. All of it had been part of a configuration he had performed before. Boone reached up and turned the corridor lights off. Total dark. Immediate and absolute, the dark of a space where the removal of light was itself a tool. Two sounds in the darkness. The metallic click of a round being chambered. And from behind the third door on the right, the sound of a small person pressing themselves against a wall and going completely expertly silent. The silence of a child who had learned that stillness was protection, who had learned it through practice. He had heard that quality of silence before, never from someone so young. Colt pressed his back to the wall and counted his heartbeat and made himself stay in front of it. Boone was at the far end, approximately 25 feet. His breathing was controlled. A man standing in darkness with a drawn weapon waiting for the other person to move first and give him a target. The click had been a round being chambered. The weapon had not been ready when Boone came in. Part of this had moved faster than Boone had anticipated. That was the first usable piece of information. Colt reached to his boot. The multi-tool was there in the same habit as everything else. He carried the habit of keeping things present because eventually necessary and immediately necessary were not as different as people assumed. He found the flashlight function, small directional narrow beam. He angled it toward the far end of the corridor, toward Boone's position, away from Dax, away from the south wall. He turned it on for 1 second. The beam hit the floor and threw enough light to confirm Boone's position, right wall 10 inches from a weapon up. And Boone's instinct was the trained instinct of every officer in a sudden light situation to orient toward the light source, to acquire it as a priority, and in the half-second of that reorientation, Colt moved. South. Fast and low, his shoulder hit the emergency exit bar. The bar gave the door opened into cold outside air and rain. And then both of them were through and the door swung shut behind them and Colt was running, 40 yards to the equipment block. Both men breathing hard. The cold outside after the building interior was immediate and significant. "Grady," Dax said, "inside." Colt looked at the front of the compound. No engine sounds. The bikes were where they had left them beyond the fence. Cord and Slade. One bar on his phone. He called Cord. 2 rings. "Where are you?" Cord said. "South side. Boone's inside. Grady separated." Colt kept his voice flat. There are children in the sealed rooms in the East Corridor. Right now. A beat of silence on the line, and he continued through it. Get Dax back to Maze. He transmits everything through their Wi-Fi. All of it, the intake logs, the transfer records, the financial ledger, the whole package. State law enforcement, federal tip lines, every media contact we have. Everything goes out simultaneously before we do anything else. And Grady, Colt looked at the building. Boone wants us controllable. He had position in that corridor and he didn't fire. There's a reason he needs us alive. That reason means Grady goes into custody before anything else happens to him. Find Slade, get him working on state contact federal if he can reach it. Go through tip lines if necessary, everything simultaneously. Everything. He ended the call. Dax said, there's a second entry point somewhere. The vehicle manifest listed private transport to coded addresses. An operation like this in rural county infrastructure has a planned exit for the people and the records. Colt was already looking at the barn. It sat at the back of the compound furthest from the road, set against the eastern fence line. A low structure with metal siding that looked newer than the surrounding property. He had cataloged it from the road. He was looking at it again now with substantially more information than he had then. They approached along the south wall of the building, moving with controlled speed, and found the barn door padlocked with a commercial lock the keycard did not touch. Colt looked at the lock, the frame, the hinges. The hinges were exterior. Old installation or a deliberate choice, the choice of someone who wanted rapid access from the inside without worrying about what the outside looked like. He had the hinge pins out in 90 seconds, and the door swung from the wrong side, and they were in. The smell arrived before the eyes adjusted. The same compound as the corridor, the same layered smell of disinfectant over the thing that disinfectant cannot eliminate. But older here, more thoroughly embedded in the structure, the smell of something that had been happening in this specific space for longer than the clinic's east wing had been configured for its current use. The interior had been divided by rough partitions of plywood and metal sheeting into a series of spaces that had nothing to do with any agricultural purpose. File boxes on metal shelving along two walls labeled in the same administrative shorthand as the intake log. 14 months of documentation in labeled boxes in a barn behind a county wellness clinic. And in the floor centered in the back section, a hatch. Steel-framed, heavy pull-handle combination lock hanging open. Not locked. Left open because someone had come through it recently from the other side and had not secured it behind them. Colt stopped breathing for a full second. Dax looked at the open lock. He didn't drive here. No. There's a tunnel. He was already inside before we reached the compound. Before Boone knew we were at the clinic, Colt said, which means Boone didn't call him. He was already in position. He looked at the file boxes, the hatch, the open lock. This is not a response to us. We walked into the middle of a closure operation. They were already shutting this location down. Moving the records, moving the people. Before the storm, before the diner, this was already running. That's why Boone didn't fire, Dax said. Dead bikers is a different crisis than arrested bikers when you're trying to close a location cleanly. Colt lifted the hatch. Battery strip lights ran along the left wall of the tunnel below the same emergency yellow as the corridor extending away into the earth in a direction that confirmed the property's geometry east, northeast toward the clinic. And from below, faint but unmistakable, the sound of organized movement. Feet on concrete. More than two people moving with the focused urgency of a group executing a protocol under time pressure. They were moving the children through the tunnel right now. His phone buzzed. Cord's voice when he answered carried something in it that Colt had heard from Cord twice. In 20 years, the sound of a man encountering a fact that his experience had not prepared him for. Grady, Cord said. They took him, not to county lockup. A pause. They took him to the clinic. Colt stood over the open hatch with the sound of feet on concrete fading below him and the tunnel running east-northeast under the earth. Grady was inside the same system now. Not in a county cell where legal mechanisms could find him. In the building that connected to the barn, that connected to the tunnel. He closed the hatch, looked at Dax. Get to Maze, transmit everything. Don't stop for anything. The children in that tunnel. Boone knows where they're going. He's the only person right now who does. Colt was moving toward the fence. And he needs us alive. That's the only leverage I have. That's not much, Dax said. It's enough to get through a door, Colt said. The drive back toward town was 4 miles on a road that had not improved. Colt rode it alone, Dax splitting off toward Maze. He thought about the timeline as he rode. Dax needed 20 minutes to transmit through Maze Wi-Fi. After that, the documentation existed somewhere Boone could not reach. The question was whether it would reach someone with authority to act before the people moving through that tunnel arrived wherever they were being taken. Boone was the only person who knew where that was, and Boone had a specific reason for not wanting dead bikers in his county tonight. That reason was information, and information was the only leverage available. He pulled into the station parking lot at 2 in the morning. Lights on in the back 2 offices in the holding area, 3 patrol vehicles, and Boone's personal truck parked at an angle near the side entrance, the angle of a vehicle left by someone who arrived quickly and did not correct it. Colt sat on his bike for a moment looking at the building. Then he walked through the front door. The deputy at the desk looked up with the expression of a man whose briefing had not fully prepared him for the actuality of what was coming through his door. He reached for the phone. "Put it down," Colt said. "Not a threat. A statement of the next 30 seconds. The deputy put it down. "Get Boone. Tell him Colt Briggs is at the front desk and wants to discuss an arrangement." 2 minutes later, Boone came through the interior door in civilian clothes. Dark shirt, work pants, no uniform, no badge visible. A conversation that would not appear in official records. He stopped at the door frame and looked at Colt with something that was trying to reproduce the administrative calm from the diner and was not entirely achieving it. "You've got nerve," Boone said. "I've got documentation," Colt said. "Transmitted 20 minutes ago to the state attorney general, 3 federal tip systems, and 7 journalists in 2 states. Intake logs, transfer records, financial ledger, 14 months of operational records from a facility in your county that you have been actively protecting." He kept his hands visible and his voice level. "I'm not here to fight you." Boone moved to the counter, not the interview rooms, the entry space front windows letting in parking lot light, the deputy still technically present. He crossed his arms. "Talk. Release Grady Carver. Stand your people down at the clinic, and wherever those children are being moved right now, let them stop." Colt watched Boone's face. "Or don't, and spend the next year explaining to federal investigators why a county sheriff provided operational cover to a network running human transport through a medical facility." "You don't know what you found," Boone said. "You know what a partial record looks like when accessed illegally by someone who entered a protected facility on a stolen credential. I know what 6 children look like in a log listed as dependents. Whatever you've transmitted is going to be evaluated in the context of a breaking and entering charge in an obstruction arrest. Your credibility." "I don't need credibility," Colt said. "I need 40 minutes. I have 67 people staged between here and Route 9 with phones recording everything they can see from public property. I have documentation sitting in inboxes right now. You can arrest me. You cannot arrest what's already been sent." Boone uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement, the movement of a man whose load-bearing structure has just absorbed damage in a location he had not adequately reinforced. Colt's phone buzzed in his jacket. He did not reach for it. It buzzed again. He held Boone's eyes. A third time. He answered by instinct without breaking the eye contact. Cord's voice stripped entirely to its operational register. "The clinic, East Wing. The rooms are empty." Colt kept his eyes on Boone. "Where?" "There's a tunnel access we missed. Goes east under the property line. We're following it now." Colt looked at Boone. And Boone's face did something that the face of a man who has been performing administrative calm for several hours does when the performance becomes structurally untenable. Not guilt. Men who had operated within systems like this for as long as Boone had operated within this one had processed guilt out of their functional range years before this moment. Something more functional. The expression of a man whose contingency plan has just activated. "Where are those children?" Colt said. Boone was quiet. "Boone." One step forward, deliberate. The deputy made a small movement and stopped when he looked at Colt's face. "Where are those children right now?" Boone looked at him for a long moment. Then the flat measuring quality behind his eyes resolved into something that was, if not honesty, at least the recognition that this particular position was no longer viable. 4 miles east on the county road," Boone said. "Past the grain elevator. There's a farm. Colt went still. The people operating in that property, Boone said, and his voice had the specific flatness of a man describing a structural reality rather than making an excuse, are not county employees. They are not under my control. What they are running tonight, I cannot stop with a phone call. And if you ride 67 motorcycles onto that property. Colt was already through the door. The parking lot of the Harlow County Sheriff's Station held at 2:34 in the morning. Colt's bike, 3 patrol vehicles, Boone's truck at its angle, and the rain coming down with the steady commitment of a storm that has found its pace and intends to maintain it. Colt was on his bike before the station door finished swinging shut. Slade was in the lot. He had materialized from the shadow at the far edge of the gravel, with the particular quietness of a man who had been waiting in exactly this location because he had anticipated this development, which was what 30 years of keeping men alive through compressed time-frame decisions produced in a person who was paying attention. Farm, Colt said. 4 miles east, past the grain elevator. Slade had his phone out before the sentence was complete. The sound of 67 Iron Remnants engines starting in sequence in the parking lot of a county sheriff's station at 2:35 in the morning was not designed to be subtle and was not subtle. It was the sound of a collective decision arrived at without a formal vote, because some decisions do not require votes, only the shared understanding of what the moment requires and the individual willingness of each person to meet it at full weight. 67 men had run their individual calculations in the time between Slade's calls reaching them and the engines turning over, and 67 men had arrived at the same result, which was the result that exists on the other side of the threshold, where you stop weighing what the action costs and start moving toward the thing that the action is for. Colt pulled onto the county road heading east. Behind him, 67 headlights followed. He thought about the timeline as he rode, and he thought about Boone's face when he said the people at the farm were not under his control. The flatness of a man describing a reality that had always been above his level. And he thought about the man he had seen through the glass in the clinic's administrative office. The profile he had recognized from a case file 2 years ago in another state, and he understood that this was not a county operation with county boundaries. The network ran through institutional frameworks in rural counties because rural counties had thin oversight, and because local authority in those counties was easier to acquire than it was in places where more people were watching. The file had a name for the network. He could not pull the name, but the shape of it was clear, and the shape meant this was not the only location, and the man who had arrived through the tunnel was not the end of the chain. That was a thought he held and did not share because there was nothing actionable about it in the next 4 miles. The farm appeared in his headlight at 4 miles precisely. Not a farm. That was clear in the first second. The visual grammar of the property was the grammar of a compound purchased for isolation and acreage and distance from neighboring windows. Not the grammar of land asked to produce something. The buildings were functional and anonymous. The fencing was newer than the surrounding structures, and lights burned in a low building at the back of the compound with the frantic intensity of people working quickly in conditions they did not design for what they are currently using them for. 2 men in civilian clothes stood at the gate. One of them held a radio. Colt killed his engine and let the bike roll to a stop 20 feet from the gate. In the relative quiet of 66 other engines also going silent, the night, filled with rain and the creak of the compound gate on its post, and the distant, barely audible sound from the low back structure of a child's voice calling a name. He sat on his stopped bike and looked at the 2 men. The man with the radio looked at 67 headlights fanned out across the county road. He looked at his partner. He looked back at the headlights. His calculation took approximately 4 seconds and produced the conclusion that his employment in this operation did not extend to this specific requirement. He stepped aside. He pushed the gate open with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man communicating his complete intention to be irrelevant to whatever came next. The second man raised the radio. Grady Carver stepped out of the dark on the east side of the road, on foot, which meant he had come through a perimeter exit that was not the front entrance. His wrist showed the faint marks of flex cuffs. He moved with the concentrated energy of a man who has spent 4 hours in a holding room, building a very specific quality of focus, and is now releasing it into forward motion. He walked to the man with the radio and took it from him without discussion, the way you take something from a person when the situation has no room for the asking. "How?" Colt said, not stopping already through the gate and moving across the compound toward the low building at the back. Back door, Grady said, falling into step. Slade is very quiet for a man his size. Good to know. They moved across the wet gravel of the compound's central space. Behind them, the iron remnants came through the gate in a controlled spread, not running, not disorganized, moving with the collective purposefulness of 67 people who had made their decision at the gate and were executing it, spreading across the compound with phones up and eyes open. Securing the space with the practiced instinct of men who had been doing difficult things in unfamiliar environments long enough that the procedure was embedded. The low building at the back of the compound had two doors. Colt took the nearer one, unlocked. They had been moving things through this building under urgency, which meant doors that were usually secured had been opened for operational access and had not been closed behind the people using them. Urgency moves forward. It does not close what is behind it. Inside a corridor lit by battery emergency lighting, the same underwater yellow as the clinic. The same smell disinfectant over the thing that disinfectant cannot cover, but older here more embedded the smell of something that had been happening in this specific space for longer than it had been happening in the clinic. 3 doors on the left, 2 on the right, all with the same additional hardware as the clinic's east wing, the same reinforced frames, the same absence of window panels. From behind the second door on the left, a voice, small working, hard to stay inaudible, and not entirely succeeding the voice of a person who had learned to be silent but could not hold the silence when they heard sounds outside the door that did not match the sounds they had been hearing. Colt looked at the door hardware and reached into his jacket for the tool set he carried in the same habit as the trauma kit and had the door open in 40 seconds. Dax held a flashlight steady behind him without being asked. 4 children seated against the back wall with the stillness of people who have learned that stillness is the safest available position when a door opens and you do not know who is on the other side. And a woman in her late 30s, thin in the way of someone who has been surviving rather than living, her hair once carefully kept and not now, positioned in front of the children, with both arms extended in the instinctive geometry of a body, placing itself between its charges and whatever is coming through the door. Colt stopped in the doorway. He kept his hands where they could be seen. He kept his voice at the same even register he had used in the back corner booth of May's roadside diner. "We're not going to hurt you," he said. "My name is Colt. We're here to get you out." The woman's arms stayed up. "There's a road outside," Colt said. 67 people on that road who have no connection to anyone who brought you here. I need you to walk with me." She looked at him, then at Dax behind him, then at the patches on their jackets. The iron remnants cut the worn leather, the visible accumulated damage of men who had not hidden what time and circumstance had done to them. She ran the calculation the same way every person in this building had learned to run calculations quickly on incomplete information under pressure, arriving at the only available option that was not a continuation of the current situation. She lowered her arms. "My children," she said. Her voice had been rationed. "Use carefully." "I see them," Colt said. "They come with you." The other rooms yielded 4 more people, 2 women and 2 more children, all in the same provisional stillness, all with the same first movement when the door opened, the instinctive positioning of a body between itself and the unknown. Colt moved through each room with the same voice and the same cadence and the same visible hands. Dax documented everything: the dimensions, the hardware, the supply arrangements, the clipboard outside each room that listed names and numbers and times in the bureaucratic language of a system that had developed its own administrative grammar through long operation. On the clipboard outside the last room at the top of the current list, a notation in the same shorthand: transfer pending. Colt looked at that notation for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Dax, Sadie, and Leo. They weren't in any of these rooms. The transfer manifest in the clinic listed them as pending, not complete, but they were moved before we got the rooms open. Dax checked his phone. Court has been tracking the second tunnel exit. It surfaces approximately 200 meters northeast of the compound. There's a vehicle track through the adjacent property going northeast. Colt was already outside. The field north of the compound was flat and saturated knee-high grass, heavy with water. The vehicle track ran northeast toward a tree line, 2 lines of compressed earth full of standing water that caught what little light there was. Colt ran across it and did not think about what his body thought about running at 2:50 in the morning after the night it had experienced. Cord met him at the tree line breathing hard, which communicated what his pace had been without requiring elaboration. Vehicle went through maybe 20 minutes ago, Cord said. Track continues into the trees, headed toward the County Road East Junction. It's them. Cord moved his flashlight to the ground at the edge of the track where a tire had passed close to the trees. In the mud pressed in and partially covered by the tire's passage was a child's sneaker. Left foot, sole separated from the upper at the toe. Leo's shoe. Colt took it from Cord's hand and looked at it. A 6-year-old boy had been moved through this muddy field in the dark and had lost a shoe and had not been able to stop. East Junction splits, Cord said. North to the highway, south toward town. Colt calculated it in the time it took to pocket the shoe. Running collapsing operation, no viable route south toward a town currently occupied by 67 iron remnants, being documented by 67 phone cameras. North, the highway. An exit route planned for exactly this contingency because you did not operate a network of this sophistication without planning the exit. He was back through the trees and on his bike before Cord completed the sentence he was forming. He rode north on the East Junction Road alone. No time to coordinate additional riders. Just the headlight and the rain in the tire tracks, still fresh enough at the road's muddy edge to catch the light for the second he needed to confirm direction. The vehicle was a quarter-mile from the highway junction, pulled to the shoulder, not crashed, not disabled, deliberately stopped engine still running, driver's door open in the way of a person who exited in a hurry and did not address the door. Colt stopped 30 feet back and cut his engine, and in the quiet he heard voices off the shoulder in the high wet grass between the road and the drainage ditch. He walked toward the voices, and the scene came out of the dark. Rex Decker on his knees in the wet grass, hands held out from his sides with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been given a precise instruction and has understood that compliance is the correct response, facing away from the road toward the ditch, remaining very still. Behind him in the grass, standing with the contained and focused attention of someone trained to hold a position under exactly these circumstances, was Rebel Pierce. 34 years old, 8 years as an Army military police officer before she was an Iron Remnant. She had run the East Intercept calculation independently, without being told, and had arrived at this location ahead of Rex Decker. That was the quality about Rebel Pierce that made her presence in the club not incidental but essential. Beside Rex, standing close together in the wet grass, not speaking, not touching anything, were Sadie and Leo Roth. Sadie was looking at Colt across 10 feet of dark, wet grass with the expression of a person seeing the confirmation of something they had decided to believe before the confirmation existed. Not relief, which would come later when there was time and space for the body to process the distance between where it had been and where it was now. Something quieter and more structural. The look of a thing that has been under continuous pressure for a very long time, being permitted, with caution and incrementally to begin releasing. Leo had found Colt's face and was not looking away from it. Colt walked to them. He stopped in front of Leo and crouched down until he was at the boy's eye level, his knees in the wet grass, the rain on the back of his neck. He looked at Leo, and Leo looked back. The boy was shaking cold in fear and the specific exhaustion of a small person who has been running on crisis beyond the duration a small person is built to sustain it. Colt did not speak immediately. He let the silence be what it was and let Leo look at him for as long as looking was what Leo needed to do. Then he took off his jacket and put it around the boy's shoulders. It was enormous on him. The hem came past his knees and the sleeves hung 6 inches past where his hands ended. Leo pushed his arms through the sleeves anyway and found the front panels of the jacket and held them closed against his chest with both hands. Colt thought about the shoe in the jacket pocket, now Leo's jacket, and decided that could be addressed when they were somewhere warm and dry. "You're cold," Colt said. "Yeah," Leo said, "very small." "We're going to fix that," Colt said. He stood up and looked at Sadie. She was straight-backed and dry-eyed. Her arms crossed in front of her in the compressed, self-contained posture she had held since the diner, the posture of a person who has learned to minimize their available surface area against a world that has provided consistent reasons to do so. She was looking at him with the same evaluating directness she had used from the moment in the booth when she had completed her 2-second assessment and decided he was not a threat. "Your mom," Colt said. Something moved across her face, deep and slow. "She's at the compound," Colt said. "She's safe. My people are with her right now." Sadie's arms came down. 1 degree. The compressed posture released fractionally, and for one moment something that was not the performance of composure appeared on her face, and then the composure reasserted itself, and the moment passed. But Colt had seen it and filed it alongside Leo's trembling and the shoe in the mud in the category of things that told you what a person had been carrying and for how long. Okay, Sadie said. Okay, Colt said. He picked Leo up. The boy went without resistance with the specific willingness of a small person who has used up what was available and is able for this particular moment to be carried. He was lighter than he should have been for 6 years old. Colt carried him back toward the road. At 6 in the morning, state law enforcement arrived at 2 entry points into Harlow County, responding to the documentation Dax had transmitted and the downstream calls from journalists who had opened their inboxes earlier than usual, and from a federal duty officer who had seen the tip line submission come in at 3:15 and had made the determination that it warranted immediate escalation rather than the morning queue. By 7, the response had moved into a different category of federal engagement, involving offices and jurisdictions that extended well beyond Harlow County. The farm compound, the clinic, the records annex, and the station were all under state authority by 7:40. The county deputies stood aside with the passivity of men who had understood in the preceding hours that the structure they had been operating within was no longer capable of protecting them, and that the position closest to cooperative was the most advantageous one available. Sheriff Dale Boone was arrested at 8:15 in his own parking lot. He walked to the state vehicle with his hands already extended and confirmed his identity for the investigator's record in a voice containing no argument and no residual performance of the calm he had been projecting since he walked into May's roadside diner the previous night. The voice of a man who had known this specific morning was a possibility for years and had been building the delay rather than making the decision that would have prevented it. Deputy Vince Cobb made his decision before noon. He stopped protecting the thing and started describing it, and his description covered enough ground to extend the active investigation into 3 adjacent counties and introduced names that had not appeared in any of the documentation Dax had pulled from the server room. Rex Decker was processed and charged by 9 in the morning on federal charges that extended well beyond Harlow County's jurisdictional limits. The man Colt had seen through the clinic's administrative office glass, whose profile he had recognized from a case file 2 years ago in another state, was in federal custody by 7. His name, when it came out in the state investigator's briefing later that morning, appeared in case files from 4 other states. The network he had been managing was larger than Harlow County and older than 14 months, and the documentation from the barn, in the clinic, and the records annex represented a fraction of its operational record. The investigation would continue for months, and the charges that eventually followed would be federal, and they would be numerous, and they would connect to people in places that Harlow County had never heard of. Colt heard all of this in pieces over the course of a morning spent at May's roadside diner. The iron remnants had not left. They occupied the space the way they occupied it after something not the chaotic overflow of the storm night, but the quieter, settled presence of people who have been through a thing together and are existing now in the specific stillness that follows an extended crisis when the crisis has resolved in the direction you were not certain it would resolve in. Coffee was continuous. May's grill ran without stopping. May Gallagher moved through the room with the same efficient, unhurried quality she brought to everything that happened in her building, refilling cups without being asked, not speaking unless spoken to her presence itself, a form of care that did not require words. Clara Roth sat in the booth nearest the window with both children pressed against her sides. Sadie on the left, Leo on the right, both of them warm now and dry in the borrowed clothing that iron remnants had produced from saddlebags, with the practical resourcefulness of people who carry more than they appear to carry. Clara did not speak much. The saying would come later in the careful, incremental way that people approach things that have been too large and too close for too long. For now, she sat with her arms around her children and occasionally pressed her face against the top of Sadie's head and breathed, and that breathing was its own language. At the booth near the window, Sadie sat with her hands around a cup of hot chocolate that May had produced without being asked. Her sleeves, Colt noticed from the counter where he was sitting, were not pulled down. They rested at her wrists where they fell, and she did not reach for them and pull them. It was the smallest possible thing. It was not nothing. Grady sat 3 booths down with coffee and a plate of eggs he was working through with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has determined that the situation has concluded in an acceptable direction and that nothing is served by rushing the eggs. His wrist showed the faint marks of the flex cuffs. He had not complained about the arrest or the holding room or anything that had happened between the clinic corridor and this booth, which was either stoicism or the equanimity of a man who had concluded that retrospective grievance consumed energy that forward motion used more productively. Leo had migrated. Sometime in the hour after they had returned to Maze, he had moved from his mother's side to the booth across from Grady. He sat there watching Grady eat with the focused, careful attention of a small person who has identified a large and apparently non-threatening presence and is conducting a methodical investigation of its properties and its reliability. Grady was ignoring this with the elaborate patience of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and is choosing not to perform it. He continued eating his eggs. Then, without looking up from his plate, he pushed the toast plate across the table to the middle. Leo looked at the toast, then at Grady's face directed at the eggs. Then he took a piece of toast. Grady continued with his eggs. Neither of them acknowledged that the transaction had occurred. Colt sat at the counter. He sat with his coffee going cold in his right hand and ran the inventory of the preceding hours with the detached professional attention he had applied to difficult situations since the first time he had applied it a long time ago in a place very different from Harlow County. What had been done correctly? What had been done at the edges of correct? What had been done entirely on instinct and had produced the necessary outcome in spite of that rather than because of it? Slade sat beside him. They did not speak for a while, which was how it was between them, after something the shared silence of men who had been through enough together to have established the common ground that most people spend the first half of a conversation building. Documentation's in federal hands, Slade said. Yeah, they'll want statements from all of us. I know. Slade turned his coffee cup in his hands. The marks of the night were on both of them, wet clothing drying slowly, the specific tiredness that comes from sustained high-stakes operation in deteriorating conditions. We're going to have exposure. The clinic entry, the server room access. Probably. You've thought about that. Since the parking lot. Slade picked up his coffee. Okay, he said. That was the complete conversation. The state investigator arrived at 8:45. She was 40 years old, precise with the economy of motion that develops in people who have worked long investigations and learned the difference between urgency and haste. Understanding that confusing them produces errors that cost more time than the haste saved. She sat across from Colt in a corner booth and asked her questions in the order that made structural sense rather than the order most comfortable for Colt. And Colt answered them completely and accurately, including the parts that were legally uncomfortable, because incomplete answers now were the kind of material that defense attorneys for people he had no interest in helping would use effectively later. It took an hour and 20 minutes. When it was done, the investigator closed her notebook and looked at Colt with an expression that was professionally neutral and contained beneath the neutrality something that was not approval, because approval was the wrong category, but was the acknowledgement of a person who has encountered a situation that required someone to act and is processing the fact that someone did. Your people need to stay available, she said. We will. She looked at the room, the iron remnants, the families. May behind the counter, the particular human ecosystem that had assembled itself in this building on Route 9 over the course of the preceding hours. You didn't have to do this, she said. Not an assessment, an observation about a fact. No, Colt agreed. She left. Cord was outside on the diner steps when Colt came out for air. He was sitting on the railing with his jacket open despite the cold because Cord ran warm and always had. A cigarette, the rare kind he saved for specific occasions. He was looking at the county road in the early morning light with the expression of a man conducting a private accounting of something significant. Colt leaned against the wall beside him. You know what I keep coming back to, Cord said. What? She wrote that note before she sat down. He took a slow pull from the cigarette. 10 years old. She came through that service door with the note already in her head and the card already in her pocket and the code already memorized. She sat down in a room full of strangers and ran the whole operation. He exhaled. That's not a child who hoped someone might notice. That's a child who built a plan and then waited for the right moment to execute it. Colt looked at the county road in the morning light. Clean after the rain, the asphalt dark and wet and empty in both directions. How many times do you think she ran that plan before last night? Cord said. Not quite a question, the kind of thing a person says when they already understand the shape of the answer and are giving it air because it has been inside them long enough. Too many, Colt said. Cord nodded. He finished the cigarette and pressed it out against the railing with the deliberate care he brought to every mechanical thing he had ever been responsible for. He was quiet for a moment. We did right, he said. To the road to the morning, to whatever accounting a 58-year-old man conducts in the quiet after a long night when the outcome came out the way it needed to. Yeah, Colt said. They stood without talking for a while. Through the diner window, Colt could see Grady's booth, could see that Leo had not moved, could see the toast plate between them mostly gone now, and Grady working through the last of his eggs with the same unhurried pace, and Leo watching him with a quality of attention that was, Colt thought, slightly less guarded than it had been 20 minutes ago. The investigation still in progress, producing preliminary findings. He watched it through the glass for a moment. Then he went back inside and stopped at Clara Roth's booth. She looked up at him with the eyes of a woman who was simultaneously at the beginning of something long and difficult, and also beneath that already in the early stages of reconstituting herself the way people reconstitute after extended periods of having that process disrupted from the outside. There are organizations, Colt said, people who do this specifically, housing legal support counseling. I can get you names and contacts before we leave. Clara looked at him. Why did you come after us? She said. Not an accusation, a genuine question asked by a person for whom the presence of genuine help had become unfamiliar enough to require an explanation. Colt thought about the napkin, the block letters, the keycard placed under the edge of a plate by a 10-year-old girl while a man's hand was on her shoulder and her brother's weight was against her side, placed in exactly the right position to be found at the right moment and not before. He thought about the precision of it, the patience of it. Your daughter, he said, trusted me with everything she had. Clara's expression moved through several things she did not put into words. Sadie was watching him from her mother's side. The dark, quick eyes that cataloged everything that had swept May's roadside diner in 2 seconds and mapped every adult in the space and found the exits and made a decision about Colt Briggs in the time it took most people to choose what to order. Colt looked at her directly. You did good, he said. Sadie looked at him for a long moment. The internal calculation was legible in the quality of her attention, the process of a person filing new information into a category structure that had been built entirely around a different kind of information and was now encountering something that requires a new category. You came back, she said, the same quiet, carrying voice from the diner booth. I said I would, Colt said. He had not said that, not in words, but she had read something in the way he held her eyes across the crowded room, and she had understood it as a commitment, and she had been right about it, and now she was filing that fact in its correct location. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, small and deliberate, the nod of someone completing a filing operation, and looked back at her mother. The iron remnants began pulling out of Harlow County in the late morning after the statements were given, and the investigators had what they needed, and the families had been connected with the state services liaison, who arrived with a van and the brisk, competent warmth of someone who did this specific work and had done it long enough to do it well. They left in groups by section, Cord's group, first then Slade's, then the others, until the maze parking lot had cleared to a dozen bikes, and then 6, and then 1 alone on the gravel in the morning light. Colt stood beside his bike for a while. The morning had the specific quality that comes after a storm has fully passed. The air washed the light, returning with the uncomplicated directness of light that has nothing left to work through. The puddles in the gravel lot were already contracting at their edges. Somewhere in the adjacent counties, investigators were working through documentation that would occupy the legal system for most of the following year and produce consequences extending considerably beyond Harlow County's borders and the names that were currently visible in the records. He reached into his jacket and took out the shoe. Leo's shoe. Left foot. Sole separated from the upper at the toe. He had carried it from the mud at the edge of the tree line to the county road to May's Diner, and it had been in his pocket through the statement and the conversation with Clara and the conversation with Sadie and the standing on the porch with cord, and now he held it in the morning light and looked at it. He thought about putting it in his saddlebag, carrying it down the highway, the way he carried DB on his wrist and the trauma kit in the oilcloth, and the specific accumulated weight of everything he carried that was not visible from the outside. Then he walked to the diner steps and set the shoe down on the second step from the bottom, where the morning light hit it directly and it could be seen without being searched for. It belongs somewhere it could be seen, not in a pocket on a highway going north. Here in this county, in the specific light of this specific morning. He mounted up. The engine fired on the first attempt. He sat for a moment with the engine running and looked through the diner window at the booth where Clara and Sadie sat with the morning light coming through the glass in a clean, unobstructed way. At Grady's booth, where Leo had apparently settled further into the investigation, his posture incrementally less guarded than it had been the process of determining that large, non-threatening things might be real, continuing its careful progress. He looked at the inside of his left wrist. DB. 2 letters. He had been 8,000 miles away on a Tuesday afternoon in October, on a road he had driven 100 times doing work that had seemed, until that Tuesday, to be the most important thing he could be doing with his life. He did not believe that last night undid that Tuesday. He did not believe that was how the accounting worked. You did not substitute one child for another and call the ledger balanced. That was not the mathematics of it, and he had never believed it was. But last night he had been in the room. He had been the person paying attention when 66 others were not. He had sat down in the booth and he had come back and he had ridden 4 miles east in the dark toward whatever the dark was holding, and he had been there for Sadie and Leo Roth in the way that he had not been there, could not have been there for Danny Briggs on a Tuesday afternoon in October 11 years ago. That was not redemption. It was not an accounting settled or a debt cleared. It was something smaller and more honest than either of those things. It was the fact of having been present when presence was what was needed, and the people that presence had been for still existing in the world this morning, which was the most fundamental outcome and the only one that finally mattered when you stripped everything else away. He pulled onto the county road and pointed north. The highway opened in front of him. Somewhere ahead, 67 iron remnants were already running their engines, carrying their collective sound through the washed morning air, the way a chord carries the low accumulated frequency of something that had no better name than here and moving and together. Colt opened the throttle and went to meet them.